Our Singapore Central Bank says a draft framework on how financial institutions and consumers can share losses arising from scams has been delayed. The Monetary Authority of Singapore says the draft is taking longer than expected due to the complexity of issues. While MAS had originally wanted to come up with the framework 3 months after it was announced in February, it wanted to ensure that the loss sharing and accountability approach incentivizes all key parties to be vigilant against scams. And the central bank is looking at publishing the consultation as soon as possible. Well, the framework was proposed after OCBC paid millions of dollars in compensation to customers who lost money in phishing scams. And to talk us through some of the challenges in coming up with a draft framework, we have with us an expert on banking law, Assistant Professor Nydia Remolina Leon from the Yong School of Law at SMU. Well, Nydia, thanks for joining us today. Why is this such a complex issue?
Thank you so much, Liz, for having me tonight. And for this very interesting question that you just asked. This is indeed a very complex issue. So it is expected that MAS is taking longer in the conversations with the different stakeholders to tackle the different issues around this type of frauds. What are the key challenges here? Finding the proper framework to allocate responsibilities and incentive efficiently among the different key stakeholders is one of the main challenges here. And what is it a challenge? Because these conversations need to go beyond contractual relationships and contractual liability. So that's why this is one of the things that adds complexity to the issue. Also, the multiplicity of stakeholders, some of them being outside of the scope of the regulatory frameworks of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, it's another layer in the complexity of this issue. The sophistication of scammers and mapping why the current regulatory framework and the different tools implemented by the banking sector and by the regulator are not enough to tackle the issues that we see today and how scammers are developing this type of scams internationally. Additionally, the savviness of financial consumers is another challenge that probably is being discussed within the framework. So there are some of the issues that make this the issuance of this new framework a very complex task.
And something you brought out, stakeholders. So typically, who are the stakeholders in a negotiation such as this, and what kind of issues can hold it up?
Well, we are used to when we talk about financial regulation and financial consumer protection, we are used to see this only involving the parties that are related to the financial sector and the financial consumer. But this issue goes beyond those two parties. So we are not talking about only the responsibility of banks and the responsibility and the duties of the financial consumer and how it can behave, how consumers can behave responsibly, but we are also involving other stakeholders that are necessary to involve and to engage in these conversations to tackle the issues of scams and frauds that we see today in markets. Those other stakeholders are, for example, social media platforms, e-commerce platforms, telecommunication companies. These are the stakeholders that are outside generally of the scope of financial regulators, but need to be engaged in order to provide an adequate framework to protect financial consumers effectively.
And, we talked about, these negotiations are complex. And, in these and similar negotiations, how far should each side prioritize trying to find, say, some sort of middle ground?
Well, that is going to be the challenge, how to find this middle ground. So what we are expecting is to see a framework that allocates responsibilities and, most importantly, incentives among these different stakeholders efficiently to prevent scams in banking transactions. So that will imply that different stakeholders will need to collaborate in the scheme and in the implementation of the framework, even if they are outside of the scope of the Monetary Authority of Singapore from a regulatory and enforcement perspective. The key elements to achieve this and to achieve an equitable framework to tackle the challenges in scams and online fraud are related to having that framework to reallocate some of the responsibilities, some of the duties, and as I said before, to recognize that advertisement, that communications to the public and with the financial consumer has changed in the past years. So we need to recognize the important role that social media platforms, telecommunication companies, and these other stakeholders play in the ecosystem nowadays. We also need to take into consideration what is the impact of shifting those duties that we understand now in the ecosystem and in the context of banking transactions. What happens if the framework reallocates responsibilities, and what would be the impact of that? We don't want to create any new gaps or to put in a disadvantage compared to what is applicable currently, and put in a disadvantage of the financial consumer. So we want the framework to also look into the impact of shifting those duties that we have now applicable in Singapore.
Oh, many thanks for speaking with us. Assistant Professor Nydia Remolina Leon there from the SMU.